The Americans believed their skies were untouchable. They had built a fortress of invisible walls, a dome of protection that stretched from the icy tundra of the Arctic to the tropical waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It was the early 1960s, the height of the Cold War, and the United States rested its head at night believing that nothing could touch it. They had the radars. They had the missiles. They had the supersonic interceptors. They had a shield that no one could break. But they were wrong. In the span of a few short months, a group of British pilots in strange triangular bombers proved just how fragile that shield really was. They did not do it with overwhelming force. They did not do it with superior numbers. They did it with silence, cunning, and a level of skill that left American generals staring at blank screens in stunned silence. This is the story of hidden valor, the fortress of North America. To understand the magnitude of what the British Royal Air Force achieved, one must first understand the giant they were up against. In the 1960s, the fear of nuclear war was not just a story in a book. It was a daily reality. The Soviet Union was the great enemy, and the United States was determined to ensure that no Soviet bomber could ever reach American soil. To guarantee this safety, the U.S. built the most sophisticated defense network in human history. It was called NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. It was a system of systems, a web of electronic eyes designed to see everything. First, there were the radar lines. The Distant Early Warning Line, or DW line, sat on the frozen edge of the world in northern Canada and Alaska. These radar stations were staffed by men who lived in isolation for months, watching green screens for the tiniest blip of an enemy plane coming over the North Pole. Behind that was the Mid-Canada line, and then the Pine Tree line. It was layer upon layer of electronic surveillance. If a bomber managed to get past the radar, it had to face the teeth of the fortress. These were the interceptors. The United States Air Force had squadrons of the fastest jets in the world. The F-102 Delta Dagger and the F-106 Delta Dart were capable of flying at twice the speed of sound. They were armed with nuclear-tipped missiles designed to blow entire formations of bombers out of the sky. And finally, there were the surface-to-air missile sites, the SAMs. These were robot sentries that stood guard around every major American city and military base, ready to launch death into the sky at a moment's notice. The American generals looked at this system and felt pride. They briefed Congress with confident smiles. They told the president that the sky was locked. They believed that a fly could not enter American airspace without NORAD knowing its speed, heading, and destination. The newspapers printed headlines declaring that the heart of America was safe. The fortress was complete, the challenger from across the ocean. While America was building its high-tech shield, Great Britain was facing a different reality. The British had come out of World War II victorious but exhausted. They did not have the endless money or resources of the United States. They could not build thousands of bombers or hundreds of radar stations. But Britain had something else. It had a history of punching above its weight. It had engineers who thought differently, and it had pilots who were trained to fly with a level of precision that bordered on obsession. The British answer to the nuclear age was the V-Force. These were 3 types of bombers built to carry Britain's nuclear deterrent. The most famous and radical of these was the Avro Vulcan. When the Vulcan first rolled out onto the runway, it looked like a spaceship that had landed by mistake. It did not have a tail. It did not have a long fuselage with wings sticking out the sides like a normal plane. Instead, the entire aircraft was one giant triangular wing. It was a delta wing. It was painted an anti-flash white to reflect the heat of a nuclear explosion, giving it a ghostly appearance. The Vulcan was a marvel of engineering. It was huge, yet it could move like a fighter jet. It could climb steeply, turn tightly, and fly at high altitudes. But inside, it was cramped and analog. There were no computers doing the flying. It took a crew of 5 men to operate this beast. The pilot and co-pilot sat upstairs in a small cockpit, surrounded by dials and switches. Downstairs, in a dark, windowless compartment often called the coal hole, sat 2 navigators and an electronics officer. They worked in the dark, their faces illuminated only by the glow of radar screens and map lights. The Vulcan crews knew they were the underdogs. They knew their plane was slower than the American fighters. They knew they had no guns to shoot back. Their only defense was their brain power. They had to outthink the enemy. They had to hide in the open sky. The invitation. It began as a friendly challenge. The United States and Britain were close allies in NATO. They often trained together. In the early 1960s, the Americans invited the Royal Air Force to participate in a massive air defense exercise. The name of the exercise was Sky Shield. The premise was simple. The British would fly their Vulcan bombers from Scotland to the United States. They would try to attack simulated targets in American cities. The Americans would try to stop them. For the American commanders, this was expected to be a turkey shoot. They viewed it as a chance to show off. They wanted to demonstrate to their British cousins just how powerful the American shield really was. They expected to spot the Vulcans hundreds of miles off the coast. They expected their interceptors to shoot down every single British bomber before they even saw land. In the briefing rooms of the Royal Air Force, the mood was different. There was no boasting. The British commanders looked at the maps of the American defenses. They saw the overlapping radar circles. They saw the locations of the fighter squadrons. It looked impossible, but the British pilots were not discouraged. They saw it as a puzzle. Every wall has a crack. Every system has a blind spot. They just had to find it. Raid 1. The Ghost in the Waves. The first attack was planned with the precision of a diamond cutter. The Vulcan crews spent weeks studying the American radar capabilities. They knew that radar works by line of sight. It sends out a beam of energy that travels in a straight line. If that beam hits a plane, it bounces back, and a blip appears on the screen. But the Earth is curved. If a plane flies low enough, the curve of the Earth blocks the radar beam. The plane hides in the radar's shadow. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would fly across the Atlantic Ocean at high altitude to save fuel. But before they reached the range of the American radar, they would drop down. They would go low, very low. On the day of the exercise, the Vulcans roared down the runways in Britain, their 4 Olympus engines shaking the ground. They climbed into the gray sky and turned west. For hours, they cruised high above the ocean, the crews saving their energy. As they approached the invisible line where the American defenses began, the order came to descend. The pilots pushed the control columns forward. The massive white triangles nosed down toward the ocean. They dropped past 20,000 feet, then 10,000, then 5,000. But they did not stop there. They kept going down until the ocean waves filled their windscreens. They leveled off at just a few hundred feet above the water. This was dangerous flying. At this height, there is no room for error. A moment of distraction, a single sneeze, or a mechanical twitch could send the bomber slamming into the sea. The salt spray from the waves coated the windshields. The turbulence down low was brutal, shaking the bones of the crew. In the back of the plane, the navigators worked furiously. They did not have GPS satellites to tell them where they were. They relied on charts, stopwatches, and calculations. They had to guide the plane through a gap in the radar coverage that was only a few miles wide. If they drifted left or right, they would be seen. Back in the United States, inside the buried bunkers of NORAD, the American operators sat in their comfortable chairs. They drank coffee and watched the green sweep of the radar lines. They were relaxed. They were waiting for the Vulcans to appear high in the sky, just like bombers were supposed to. The screens remained empty. The radio was silent. "Sector clear," one operator reported. "No contacts," said another. The commanders checked their watches. The British should be here by now. Where were they? Had they turned back? Had they gotten lost over the ocean? The interceptor pilots sat in their ready rooms, playing cards, waiting for the siren that would tell them to scramble. The siren remained silent. The jet sat on the tarmac, their engines cold. Meanwhile, the Vulcans were racing toward the coast at 500 miles an hour, skimming the tops of the waves. They were invisible ghosts. The curve of the Earth protected them from the electronic eyes of the fortress. They crossed the coastline of North America without a single alarm sounding. They were inside the fortress. Now came the second part of the plan. They could not drop bombs from this low altitude. They needed to pop up. The Vulcan pilots pulled back on the controls. The engines screamed as they went to full power. The bombers rocketed upward, climbing from the deck to thousands of feet in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, the radar screens in the American bunkers lit up like Christmas trees. "Contact!" yelled an operator. "Multiple contacts. Inland. They are already inland." Panic erupted in the command center. This was impossible. The blips had appeared out of nowhere. They were not out over the ocean. They were directly over the cities. "Scramble! Scramble! Scramble!" The sirens finally wailed across the air bases. American pilots dropped their cards and sprinted to their jets. Afterburners lit up the runways as the Delta darts and Delta daggers clawed into the sky. They flew fast, breaking the sound barrier in their desperation to catch the intruders. But it was a futile chase. By the time the American fighters reached the altitude of the bombers, the Vulcans had already opened their bomb bay doors. They had already electronically released their simulated nuclear weapons. The targets, New York, Chicago, Washington, were theoretically destroyed. The Vulcans then dove back down toward the ground, disappearing from the radar screens as quickly as they had appeared. They turned east and vanished back into the Atlantic Ocean, leaving the American fighters chasing nothing but exhaust fumes and empty air. The reaction: shock and denial. When the exercise ended, the silence in the American briefing rooms was deafening. The mighty shield had failed. The fortress had been breached. The American generals were in shock. They looked at the data tapes. They watched the replay of the radar screens. One moment, the sky was empty, and the next moment, British bombers were over the targets. The embarrassment was deep, but human nature is stubborn. Rather than admitting that their system was flawed, many American commanders went into denial. They made excuses. "They got lucky," one general said. "The radar was undergoing maintenance." "It was a fluke," said another. "They took a risk flying that low. In a real war, they would have crashed." They convinced themselves that this was a one-time event. They told the British, "Good show, but don't expect it to happen again." The British crews said nothing. They stood in the back of the room, listening to the excuses with polite expressions. They knew it wasn't luck. It was skill, and they knew they could do it again. Raid 2, the electronic war. A few months later, a second exercise was scheduled. This time, the Americans were not taking any chances. They were angry. They were determined to crush the British bombers and restore their pride. They reinforced every gap in the radar line. They put airborne radar planes up to scan the low altitudes, looking specifically for the wave-skimming tactic the British had used before. They moved missile batteries to the coast. The pilots were briefed to stay alert for low-flying intruders. The American message was clear: "We know your trick. Try coming in low this time, and we will catch you." The RAF commanders knew the Americans would be waiting for the low-level attack. If they tried the same trick again, they would be slaughtered. They needed a new plan. They needed to do the exact opposite of what the enemy expected. They decided to go high. But going high was suicide. At high altitude, a bomber is visible to radar for hundreds of miles. It sticks out like a sore thumb. How could they survive up there? The answer lay in the back of the Vulcan, with the electronics officer. The Vulcan was equipped with a secret weapon called ECM, electronic countermeasures. These were powerful jamming devices designed to confuse enemy radar. On the day of the second raid, the Vulcans took off and climbed. And they kept climbing. They went up to 50,000 feet, into the thin, cold air where the sky turns a dark purple. As they approached the American coast, the American radar operators saw them immediately. "Contact!" shouted an operator. "High altitude. Multiple targets. They're coming in right through the front door." The American commanders smiled. This was exactly what they wanted. The British were walking into a trap. "Scramble all fighters," the general ordered. "Intercept and destroy." Dozens of F-102s and F-100s roared into the sky. They climbed steeply, their afterburners glowing. The pilots looked at their radar screens, expecting to see the solid blip of the British bombers. They prepared to lock their missiles. But when they turned on their attack radars, chaos broke out. Inside the Vulcans, the electronics officers flipped their switches. The jamming transmitters roared to life. They blasted the American frequencies with powerful electronic noise. On the American screens, the clear blips of the bombers suddenly disappeared. In their place was a blizzard of white static. The radar screens looked like they were filled with snow. The American pilots were blind. They looked out their windows, searching the vast sky for the white triangles, but the sky is a big place. Without radar to guide them, finding a single plane is like finding a needle in a haystack. The ground controllers try to help. Target is unable to track, they stammered. We are experiencing heavy jamming. We have lost the targets. The jamming didn't just hide the Vulcans. It created phantom targets. The American radar would suddenly show a dozen bombers attacking from the south, then the north. Fighters were sent chasing ghost signals that vanished when they got close. The radio channels filled with confusion. Where are they? I can't see them. My scope is washed out. I have nothing but static. I'm chasing a ghost echo. While the American defense system collapsed into confusion, the Vulcans cruised silently overhead. At 50,000 feet, they were above the weather, above the chaos. They were untouched. The American fighters burned up their fuel-chasing phantoms. They flew in circles, angry and frustrated. The mighty missiles stayed on their rails because they couldn't lock onto anything. The Vulcans flew straight to their targets. They flew over the air bases where the fighters had launched. They flew over the command bunkers. The navigators looked through their sights and called out the release points. Bombs gone. Once again, the theoretical cities were destroyed. Once again, the fortress had been breached. The Vulcans turned slowly and headed for home. They turned off their jammers, and suddenly they reappeared on the American screens, disappearing over the horizon as if to wave goodbye. The aftermath, a lesson learned. The second raid changed everything. There could be no more excuses. There was no denying the truth. The British had not just gotten lucky. They had completely outsmarted the most advanced military machine on Earth. Not once, but twice. In the Pentagon, the mood was somber. The generals had to face a hard reality. They had placed too much faith in technology. They believed that because they had the best machines, they were invincible. They had forgotten the human element. The British had proven that a smart opponent is dangerous, no matter what equipment they are flying. They proved that predictability is a weakness. They proved that the biggest shield in the world is useless if you don't know where to hold it. For the crews of the Royal Air Force, the return home was quiet. There were no parades in London. There were no medals pinned on chests in front of cheering crowds. They landed their Vulcans in the English rain, climbed out of the cramped cockpits, and went to the mess hall for a cup of tea. They didn't brag. They didn't boast to the newspapers. It wasn't the British way. But among themselves, there was a deep satisfaction. They shared a look that said, "We showed them." The legend of these raids spread quietly through the military world. It became a story told in officer clubs and training academies. NATO allies whispered about it with a mix of shock and admiration. Did you hear about the Vulcans? They broke the shield. In Paris, the French smiled. In Germany, the pilots nodded in respect. And in Moscow, the Soviet generals took notes. They realized that the American defense was not as perfect as it seemed. The legacy of the hidden valor. Years passed. The Cold War eventually ended. The Vulcan bombers were retired from service. They were parked in museums, their engines silent, their white paint fading. Today, people walk past these massive triangular planes. They look at the strange shape and read the plaques about range and payload. They see a relic of the past. But the men who flew them see something else. They see the machine that humbled the giant. The lesson of the Vulcan raids is not about airplanes. It is a lesson about mindset. It teaches us never to underestimate the underdog. It teaches us that arrogance is the first step toward defeat. The Americans thought they were untouchable because they were big and powerful. The British knew they were vulnerable, so they became sharp and cunning. The Vulcan crews proved that warfare is not just about who has the bigger stick. It is about who has the sharper mind. Decades later, American and British pilots still fly together. The rivalry has turned into a deep respect. American pilots who learn the history of their Air Force are taught about the days when the sky was full of snow and ghosts. They are taught that no defense is perfect. And somewhere in a quiet retirement home in England, there may be an old man sitting in a chair. He doesn't look like a warrior. He looks like a grandfather. But close his eyes, and he is back in the cockpit of a white triangle. He is skimming the waves of the Atlantic, salt spray on the glass, flying into the teeth of the fortress. He remembers the silence of the radio. He remembers the confusion of the interceptors. He remembers the feeling of slipping through the untouchable shield. He remembers the hidden valor. The skies of North America are still watched today. Satellites and computers have replaced the old radar screens. The technology is far more advanced than it was in the 1960s. But the ghost of the Vulcan still haunts the memory of the Defense Command. It serves as a permanent reminder. Nothing is impenetrable, and legends are not always written by the victors or the superpowers. Sometimes, they are written in the contrails of a few brave men who dare to try the impossible, and who prove that even the sky has a back door if you are brave enough to find it.